Welcome to the second of our three-part video series featuring experts from the Criterium Oncology Consortia. Hello, Dr. Camidge.
Hi, Taryn.
It's nice to meet you.
Likewise.
Let's talk about COVID and clinical trials. We know that COVID threw all clinical trials into disarray. How is ATOMIC, and for those who don't know, that's the Academic Thoracic Oncology Medical Investigators Consortium, wow, meeting the challenges of lung cancer trials specifically as the industry adapts to a post-COVID world?
Well, COVID certainly sort of came out of the blue and, we had to adapt. So ATOMIC is made up of now 15 different academic centers across the USA and Canada. And so there wasn't a uniform approach. It was done individually by different sites. But what I can tell you is that commonly people would review the clinical trials in their portfolio and say, look, this is a nice to have, or it's just observational, or there's a standard of care. We have limited staffing on site. We're going to put those on hold. For something that is mission critical, this is the best drug in the world and you can only get in the clinical trial, we just found a way of making it happen. And I think the biggest issue that affected us was normally patients come from out of state. And about 20% of patients, will normally travel to Colorado if we take ourselves as an example, and that really shut down during COVID. For many other sites, though, they're really, their catchment area is their backyard, and that had less of an impact. In the post-COVID world, I think we've learned some lessons. What we're doing now is essentially telehealth. We have become very familiar with interacting whilst not being in the same room, and I think there will be an advantage to some patients for some visits, but maybe those can become telehealth. You don't have to, get on an airplane just so that someone can check your blood pressure and say everything's fine, go back home again. So I think there will be some advantages from that.
That was going to be my follow-on. Will some of these lessons learned be sustainable as we go forward?
Well, they will. I mean, honestly, I think the biggest Pandora's box that we've opened with telehealth is the whole idea about practicing medicine across state borders. You may recall that in the midst of the pandemic, they just said, forget all that, just do what you need to do, which was the right approach. Now people are trying to rebuild some of that infrastructure, and some of it is, if I'm in Colorado and you're in Pennsylvania and I don't have a medical license in Pennsylvania, it may be considered inappropriate for me to discuss anything to do with your medical care virtually. Honestly, it seems incredibly silly to me because you could be talking on your cell phone and you drive across a state border and you're illegal on, at the beginning of the phone call and legal at the end of the phone call. So I think that is going to have to be something which is taken on at a much higher level, at the DC sort of level.
I think that's a really interesting point. It's going to be interesting to see as we go forward into this next frontier, how that shakes out for sure.
Well, it feels, state-specific licenses, I have to tell you, feels very much like the 19th century. It seems very odd in a kind of Zoom savvy world that, we don't sort of mature our approach.
Agreed. How is medical practice so different in Colorado than it is in Pennsylvania?
Well, I mean, why can't you have a national medical license? Why do I have to submit paperwork to, 50 different states? I mean, it seems a little silly. There are even approaches by some patient advocacy groups to say, okay, well, let's have a two-tier system. Sure, the guys who are the generalists who you need in that state, they gotta meet a certain standard. But maybe a second opinion from an expert, and maybe, there's only one in the world and they happen to be in, Madagascar, we should find a way of just making that legal so that patients can benefit from it.
I think that's a really interesting point and one that we haven't discussed too much. So thank you so much for bringing that to the forefront. Let's talk about advancing science in terms of applying translational research in thoracic oncology. So what are you doing? What's happening in your world?
Well, thoracic oncology really has been the poster child amongst solid tumors for translational oncology. And what I mean by that is the concept of not defining treatment by what a cancer looks like down the microscope or just its organ of origin. This is a lung cancer, therefore we should treat everybody the same. Maybe over the last 15 years, we've started to fragment lung cancer into different diseases based on the molecular abnormalities. So things that down the microscope, they look the same, but when you pull out the DNA, this one has that mutation, this one has that gene abnormality, and that has changed our treatment. And that concept of personalized medicine has been, I would say, the first major therapeutic revolution in lung cancer. The second one was immunotherapy, but honestly, immunotherapy still needs to go through a personalized medicine revolution. They're still trying to give it to everybody and getting the kind of results you get when you try and have one size fits all.
You know, in the same way that we're just talking about how regulations need to catch up, do regulatory bodies need to catch up to all the advances that are happening in science right now? Because it seems like science is jumping way ahead.
Well, they are. It's really interesting. So, you know, without boring you too much with the history, you know, when the very first molecular subtype of lung cancer, something called an EGFR mutant lung cancer with a targeted therapy that worked, the FDA was kind of caught on the back heel with that. They didn't know how to partner an approval with, you know, a molecular test. If you look back at the FDA minutes from, you know, 10 plus years ago, they're saying, well, but we don't have an FDA approved test. You can't use this test. You know, we have to put that through regulatory processes. And that built the idea of something called a companion diagnostic that had to have its own package, almost like its own device that had to be submitted at the same time. That seems to be lessening, partly because the molecular testing has become multiplexed. You know, you push one button and you get 400 genes, and then sort of, you know, having to prove each individual one in some submission package, I think is sort of, you know, going away. Honestly, in the real world, you know, that companion diagnostic was about getting a drug licensed. In the real world, people just use whatever diagnostic they can get their hands on, which is actually how the European Medicines Agency had done it from the get-go. We'll license a drug for an EGFR mutation. You guys go figure out how you find one.
Seems like a more expeditious approach, actually. So,
well, you know, I think so. The two biggest drug licensing agencies in the world are the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, and the FDA. And you know, sometimes you point to one and go, "Wow, they totally messed it up," or sometimes you go, "They did it really great. We should follow that." And I think there's a concertina effect, you know, where they're each keeping an eye on each other and sort of learning from each other. And I think that's been real progress.
I think that's great, because not one entity is solely responsible for all of the developments or moving the science forward. So that's great. You talked about personalized medicine just a minute ago, and it really, those advances are putting patients front and center. So, you know, when we talk about cancer, it's not just cancer, it's really personalized cancer. How is Atomic addressing patient needs in this personalized world?
Well, I think, you know, when I first set up Atomic, and I have to be honest, I was very excited when I came up with that acronym. It is without doubt the best acronym, just to be clear. I found the TO for thoracic oncology, and then the rest just fell into process. And it's funny, it's terribly silly, but I think people like belonging to it just because it's got a cool acronym. But when I set it up, I wanted geographic spread of the sites, you know, the concept that clinical trials should only be located in, you know, one little sort of oasis, you know, perhaps in the Northeast or somewhere where they traditionally were, you know, wasn't doing the patients any service. You know, the patients were geographically distributed. So we made sure we had sites, you know, north, south, east, and west in the United States. We also made sure we had a Canadian site most recently to kind of, you know, really go across the border there. In terms of expertise, though, you know, I deliberately chose sites which were very good at molecular testing and doing that kind of personalized medicine, and that would include us in Colorado, and then exporting that knowledge to the other sites. Equally, you know, I chose some sites which were particularly good at the cutting edge of immunotherapy. Johns Hopkins would stand out in that regard, and you know, they're exporting their knowledge. And then, you know, not just geographic spread, but you know, on the personalized aspect, you know, a lung cancer patient isn't a kind of, you know, uniform thing. You know, on the West Coast, we have racial differences than we have in the Southeast. We have smoking level differences. And the idea is we need a net that will capture everything and everybody.
That's excellent. And as you think about moving forward, where do you see the frontier of thoracic oncology going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think it is all about personalized medicine. And just to come back to one of the other reasons why we set up Atomic in the first place is, you know, you used to be able to come up with a clinical trial idea, get some money from a pharmaceutical company, either with a small pharmaceutical sponsored trial or an investigator initiated trial or some variation on that theme. And sometimes you could just do that study within, 1 or 2 centers because you were treating everybody the same. I mean, our own center has, 400 new lung cancer patients a year, which would be great if they were all uniform, but they're not. When you start to go down to this personalized level, we may only have 2 or 3 of people with a particular flavor of lung cancer. And so you have to go multi-site. You have to spread that net wider, and you need that coordination. And I think the pharmaceutical industry has had to wake up to that you can't just, pay for something that goes on in even a big center. You have to go multi-site even for these relatively novel ideas. And that's where the Criterium Consortia come in. And they've really been instrumental in pushing that to the forefront, taking bright ideas and being able to do a multi-site study on a pretty reasonable budget.
That's fantastic. You talked just a second ago about treating patients with some of these innovative therapies that are coming up. Where do you stand on the concept of clinical trials as a therapy option?
Well, so a clinical trial is neither a good thing nor a bad thing. It is essentially an envelope that something is contained within, and sometimes that's a good thing or a bad thing. So what you really want is you want an expert who says, look, what you need is X. And the only way I can get access to X is a clinical trial. Therefore, you need a clinical trial. I mean, sure, there's a societal benefit that, A versus B, is always helpful. It generates knowledge. But for an individual patient, for Mrs. Jones sitting in front of you, or if you're the patient, the doctor sitting in front of you is telling you about a trial, the very first question you should ask is, what would you do if I didn't go on this clinical trial? If they would do something completely different, but sounds better, I wouldn't do the trial. If they were going to do something that is completely different, that sounds terrible in comparison, I'd do the trial. Or maybe what they would do as a standard of care, you can keep in reserve and do the trial first. So there isn't a simple answer to your question, but I do believe that the kind of sites that we've recruited are trying to use the clinical trial process to select the best possible treatments for their patients, and therefore it really is part of the best possible care.
You were just talking about sites they're such an integral part of the clinical development process. What is it that, what's the biggest challenge for sites right now? Is it the payments coming in from the manufacturers? Is it recruiting the patients? Where are your biggest hurdles?
Well, so it's the same as with everything. So it's kind of, red tape and money. So what delays opening a clinical trial is, the reimbursement by the drug company for the things which are not perceived as standard of care. Somebody has to coordinate the trial. There are certain scans or blood tests or whatever that have to be done that aren't normally billable to insurance. And then there's always red tape. There's always language which is called injury and compensation language. So if I put you on miracle drug X and your nose falls off, who's liable for that? And that gets argued. Honestly, one of the advantages of the consortium is that as the director, I get to see all of that information, which is normally hidden behind individual sites. And I can say, guys, that, your office said, oh, this is the only budget we can do. You're 10 times higher than this other site. And you are able to feed back and say, look, the people who put in a low opening bid and the people who put in a massive opening bid, you both ended up in relatively similar, place. The difference is one made that decision in 6 weeks and the other took, 10 months to do it. And so over time, the knock-on benefit of being in a consortium is that we help all of the sites do a little better.
Fantastic. Dr. Camidge, thank you so much for spending some time with us and sharing your insights on this really great topic. Thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Good to talk to you.